I'd like to welcome you to another conversation about art. Today, we're going to be talking to Steven Seinberg, an East Coast abstract artist. Welcome, Steven.
Hello, thanks.
I'm I'm really glad that you're able to join us. I've been following your work for the last couple of years, and I think your work's amazing.
I appreciate
So we
that.
just want to ask you some questions about your work. And the first question I'd like to ask is, how did you first get into art? Have you been doing it your whole life?
Yes, I have. I've been drawing and uh, photographing my whole life, and I originally was when I was finishing high school, I was really into photography and thought that that would be where I was headed, and went to college to study photography, and wound up finding it limiting to what I felt like I wanted to do, started wanting to do. And I guess I started um, being, I guess, exposed to a lot of other art and a lot of other things. And I started trying sculpture and did that for a little while. And then I thought printmaking would be a nice maybe balance between photography and painting or something like that that I would enjoy. So I started printmaking for a while, and that led to painting. Um, and that's kind of what stuck, I think. So um, I feel like in a way that's a great way for it to work. Like the idea is that I knew I was going to make art. I just hadn't figured out how yet.
Mm.
And so painting is kind of what kind of took over for me. And I did I wound up in college doing a lot of painting and printmaking and dual majoring, and just been painting ever since, really. And also taking photographs still as well, but it in a different for different reasons.
Well, Paul and I are both photographers. Do you ever show your photographs?
Um, I actually really don't very often get to show my photographs. I I spent a lot of time not holding a camera and not carrying a camera, and I think um, over the last 10 years I've started doing it more and more, and um, so I'm pretty constantly taking photos, and um, I wonder if, yeah, maybe one day that I will probably show them with something. It just seems it, they're not the same as the work I'm doing, but but there are a lot of things about them that really carries over. A lot of it is the composition of the pieces, and even a lot of the tones and things that I use are really because of a love of black and white tone photos and all these other images that I'm so interested, the way the blacks look and the way the whites look, and so a lot of that kind of carries over into the paintings.
So how many years have you been doing like these large scale paintings that we've seen?
30 years.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah.
So what art school did you go to?
I went to Atlanta College of Art, which was a museum school that became SCAD now in Atlanta, and well, which was the Savannah College of Art and Design. And um, I, that actually was a really great experience. I was in a regular university before that for several years, and wound up leaving because of the art department. And what I felt was like almost like imposed rules on how to make art. So I I decided that that was completely unnecessary, and I left. And found myself back in school when I found this program. That was just amazing, and the teachers were. It was just it made a big difference for me. You know, I guess I finished that program 30 years ago, and I've been pretty much working as full-time artist ever since.
Did you meet other artists that you're still in touch with?
Yes, some that I'm slightly in touch with, some from that time period. I don't know if it was from school or I was showing with galleries towards the end of being in school, and started meeting other artists that way. And some of those artists I'm still showing with in galleries now.
So did you have a gallery when you finished school?
Yes. When I left school, I moved to Atlanta and started showing in smaller scale galleries, kind of built up to showing in a really nice gallery. And at the same time as I restarted going to school. And when I finished school, I wound up switching into another gallery in Atlanta that was really one of the top galleries in Atlanta. And so that kind of helped start my career in a sense, because they were able to do things that there was no way I could do, and show it to different people and get it in different collections. And that kind of helped me to be where I am now. And I still work with that gallery. So that was from 94.
Do you interact and share ideas with other contemporary artists these days, or do you kind of work on your own?
I mostly work on my own, but there are a few artists I do talk to, and some more regularly than others. But there's a few artists in my building here that I like going to see what they're working on and getting a chance to talk about things. And it seems like a good way to escape my own head, and the way you kind of your head can spin with your own work. And I have another friend in Portugal that I talk to. There's another artist up there, and we show in different galleries around the world together. So we get a chance to talk every once in a while too, which is nice. To answer your question, really, no, not enough. I feel like sometimes it's actually would be nice to spend more time talking about the work with other artists, and kind of having more of that, which is really kind of the best part of being in school for art, was, you know, so much dialogue, so many different artists to talk to, ideas that kind of could flow around. That seems a lot. I spend a lot of time in this cave. Well, it's not quite a cave, but in here by myself, like it's kind of like every day, all day. And then really it feels like it's rare that I have someone to talk to about the work.
When you start creating like a new piece, do you have like a specific idea of what you want to do, or do you just start painting and see what comes out? Or I guess in other words, is it when you paint, is it more intellectual or more intuitive?
There's a combination. So I feel like I generally start, there's something I'm starting from. There's something, a composition, a general division of the space, a line from a poem. A lot of times I might do little sketches of what tends to wind up being the darker kind of skeleton of the painting, and then the paintings can start from something that resembles that. that there's a, I'm working in the sketchbook in a space that's the dimensions of the canvas I'm going to work on. So I'm kind of, in a sense, laying out the space at the beginning. And then I'll tend to start the painting that way. But from there, everything is unknown. The difference in scale is everything. And the difference in being able to layer things over time is everything. So I don't know I really don't know what it's going to look like when it's done. But there's a method as it keeps going. It's not as intellectual as it is kind of a constant balance.
But like, is there an idea or a theme that you're trying to work out in these series of paintings?
Yeah, generally it's both. But I also feel when I'm working on one piece, there are choices to be made, right? And each choice can take you in a different direction. And sometimes I feel like it doesn't all have to happen in one painting. There's a reason now to start another one to see where that would go. And because in the paintings that I'm doing, there's a need to not just keep piling the paint on. If there needs to be areas that are much thinner and left back to the beginning, and areas that are much thicker. And in order to kind of get that balance, there has to be a way of working that's slow. And so while working on the painting, and I'm maybe working on several others at the same time, and I have other options of ways to take the painting. And I like being able to work in multiples like this, where I feel like the idea that I'm working on doesn't really have to be over and done because I finished that one piece. And I don't have to feel like, well, there's so much more I want to do. I have to keep going when the piece is telling me that it's ready now, And so I like that freedom. I feel like maybe that's the freedom of knowing that I can start another one, which is kind of a good idea. And I think, to go a little further with that, sometimes it actually helps finish the paintings, because if I get stuck on one and I start another one that's kind of similar and it goes in a totally different direction, and then I learn something from that one, I can bring it back to the one that was giving me trouble, that I might have had to turn around because I couldn't sleep at night looking at it. So I just don't think you can make a great piece of art or a painting by completely knowing what it's going to look like when you're done. Like, I don't think that leaves what magic painting can do open to happen. I think it's like I could think about how I have all these ideas of what I want to do. But I have to also, like, I think of it as like, that's how I want to start. And then the process is going to determine a lot more than I am.
Steven, it's fascinating to listen to you talk about your process. And when you said that a line of poetry might inspire you, immediately my imagination started working, because that's one of the things that I found so fascinating about many of your images, the scribbles, the writing on them. What's the connection between writing, poetry, and art for you?
I like there's something about poetry and painting that seems to be, to me, like really on the same plane. Um, there's it, the type of writing that it is. I guess it's what I hope my paintings do, that they're like poems and that they have that kind of a flow to them, and where that they have the only the necessary words, and I think when the words that are in my paintings, it started out being kind of note-taking directly on the paintings, and then I started in, I feel like responding to how the written words and the way that they were staggered looked like poetry in a book or something. And I think the writing sometimes was things that I read, things that I was thinking, things that I heard, things that I was thinking about while I was painting. And over time, they've kind of progressed into more poetic lines, sometimes mine, sometimes not, sometimes pieces of other people's poems that I've just totally inspired a painting. Maybe a few words from that, or a line or two. There are several paintings that are titled and contain pieces of poetry from poets like Octavio Paz, and sometimes it could just be one line or one part that I had read from a poem or that I've been reading that winds up the title of a painting. Maybe so some of these titles could be, and it starts to be kind of blur in my head. Sometimes I'm very specific about making sure they're those lines, and then making sure I'm specific about, you know, where it came from. And sometimes it's just a bunch of lines in my head that maybe rearranged or wound up. But in the end, the writing in the paintings becomes more visual than legible. I'm writing and rewriting and writing over it and painting over it. It seems to refer to itself as maybe poetry or notes taken on the edge of a page, but visually it's another form of the line making, and I think that it has a good balance to me, using like this idea of also this universal language, as you can't read it, that it's apparently language.
Yeah.
Which doesn't matter whose language, which to me also relates to painting in a sense.
It occurs to me that so many of the painters, artists I admire have this interaction, this kind of cross-pollination between so many different art forms and genres. And it was very interesting to me to hear about your journey as an artist, and, you know, photography that you're still doing, and sculpture, and now poetry as well. How do you feel all of these things kind of interact for you?
I think they all come together for me. I'm generally a painter. I like to make things. I mean, that's the general draw to all of it for me. What would sculpture be for me now? You know, at this point in my work, like what would it look like? You know, and I've been working on that, experimenting, and I think that that's really, for me, all of it. It's experimenting within painting and experimenting within other things is only broadening my painting. I kind of always feel like I want to grow as an artist and continue to grow as an artist. And it can be, that can be a struggle. And being an artist, a showing artist, makes that more of a struggle. in a sense, because many of the galleries I've worked with and everything, they like what you're doing and they want you to keep doing that. For me, like having the freedom to experiment and try things and see what would happen is what lets me grow and lets my work progress. And so with all of them, all of these, you know, working with different materials, working with sculpture, working with painting, it's like the idea is like, what would happen? Like, if I did that, what would happen? Like, that's more interesting than anything I can think of, to see what would happen and how that works into the other work I'm doing. I could see big shifts in my work over time, but there's a long period of time. I've become a little less fearful over the years. Like, I think I started out really unfearful and then maybe became a little more fearful, and then I've become much less fearful over the years. I was young when I started with the gallery, so it was both a good thing and a bad thing in a sense.
There were some common elements among your images, these kind of motifs, like I put this in quote marks because I don't want to like put a label on it, right? Because they are interpreted in so many different ways, but storm clouds, maybe what I see as kind of tendrils, quite organic forms, but they could also be maybe wires. There's those little crosses, which could also be birds, and drips as well. Why do you use these repeated motifs?
There's an organic nature to all of the forms that
Yeah,
I'm
yeah.
using. They tend to mean different things to me throughout the years that I'm working.
Okay.
And they kind of shift what I'm using and why I'm using, but there's often, I don't know what to call, almost objects in my paintings, that they're
Hmm.
not color field. There's an interaction between objects or figures. They could be, you know, biological objects or plant life, but there's often, well, there's often two of them. So there's often this kind of relationship kind of that's kind of happening between them, whether it's a symbiotic relationship or some other type of relationship. The paintings to me always revolve around like a figure or an object. And I say figure, but I guess I don't know if I mean human figure as much as I mean that there's always like these focal points that are interacting in some way. I need that in the paintings. Just the open areas of color and space, they need this object to me to move in that space. And that's so I tend to, I think almost all of my paintings will have some form like that in it, whether it's multiple forms or a single form, or a lot of cases this duality.
This particular piece, it contains the different elements we've already talked about. It has some, you know, elements of poetry, and it also has these little crosses, or Paul said they might be birds. So can you talk more specifically about what went into this and what it means for you?
Sure. This piece being part of the group of work I've been working on, where the painting is divided into these two parts, the paintings that have these darker halves. I've been working on this idea of dimensions, a different place, the same place, a different time, that where these two things are interacting but completely separate. And this piece, it has that element to it. And you asked about the left side of the painting with the crosses, the little crosses and areas marked out. And one of the other themes is the idea of systems. What I'm using these for in these areas are little systems that are kind of conglomerating together on those areas on that side. I have thought of them as birds before. I have thought of them as different species that are conglomerating together. But in this one, I was kind of working on this idea of an estuary. And so these were kind of parts of the systems in the estuary. You know, they tend to reappear and reoccur in other paintings, and because it's a language that I'm creating, and the language is changing over time. They're always kind of, you know, either pushing closer and closer together, or and not touching, or further and further apart, and they become these kind of systems, I guess is the best kind of thing I can think of to call them.
In the dark side of the painting too, does that figure represent anything for you? I mean, to me, it looks like a wilted flower, but I don't know if that's too simplistic.
Not necessarily too simplistic. What they're representing is more of like, there's a lot of these, the systems have these cycles, so there's like an end and a beginning, and a lot of the things that I'm working with have both an end and the beginning. I tend to use these figures that are kind of representing that to me in a way of using the space. In this one, what's happening on the left side is also happening on the right side, but it's not necessarily the same time or the same place. In a sense, multiple paintings could be from a different, an alternate path. And in these paintings, the alternate path is within the same painting.
I see this in almost all of your pieces. You seem to be able to create this real translucent feel in the background of your painting. So do you do that consciously, or is it just something that happens as you're working on the piece? And I'm curious too how you create it.
I do consciously paint that way. They're very thin, multiple layers that allow that translucence, and it also allows me to build things up slowly, and what I like to have in the paintings is the air and light that comes from the thinner sections of paintings that the opaqueness doesn't give. And so that the combination of the two, allowing those lighter areas to kind of move through the painting, where the opaque areas is kind of what stops you. And I think it's kind of the way I like to compose the painting, and it's kind of also why I feel they have to happen in a slow, methodical way that kind of allow them to paint to go. I put paint on and I take paint off as well. So I'm covering things and wiping things off, and I'm working on multiple paintings at a time so that the layers can dry and another layer can be translucent over it. That's how that kind of surface occurs.
The figure in the right is echoed on the left side, but it was so faint, I just didn't see it until we really spent some time with it.
It's a good example of, in some ways, the way I want my paintings to be seen. They're not seen all at once.
Yeah.
In the same way that there's a slowness to painting them, there's a slowness to seeing them. It's the subtleness in some of the things that I'm doing that are subtle changes and subtle distinctions that I want things to come in, to become apparent maybe, or come into view after you've seen something else, so that it's not all at once. And I think you see that in a lot of the pieces.
We're looking at one painting now. What is your kind of ideal exhibition?
It varies. I think my ideal show is probably 10 to 15 paintings, maybe 10 to 12 paintings, and then maybe another 10 to 20 smaller works on paper. I've become obviously more specific about how I like my work shown. The years of showing, I've shown in galleries for a long time, and I've seen what I like and what I don't like. And what I want is space. I want each painting to have its kind of own space. I don't like things hung close together. I like a certain type of lighting directly on the walls and not on anything else. But what I really like is the paintings to have the space to breathe and not run into each other, but that you can approach each one on its own. I've had the lucky opportunity to have several shows like that. To me, that's the way the work functions best, that it, instead of seeing multiple pieces right next to each other to compare to each other, that memory of one lingers to the next one, in a sense. When you're looking at one, you're only looking at that one, maybe with the memory of the last one you've seen, not right next to it.
Who's your ideal viewer? How do you want people to look at your paintings?
That's a good question, right? Other than that, I want them to have the time, to take the time to see them. There's no intention of mine for anybody to get them all at once and walk up and say, oh yeah, I get it. I don't need that. I like the way that you see things that you haven't seen before, that you, in a different light and a different time, or as you walk past them, that they're allowed to be seen over time. And I think maybe even that is one thing that makes it hard for me to have too many pieces too close together, because I don't think it allows for that either. What I do like is maybe having a really small piece next to a really large piece. It does something different for each piece, because like my works on paper, they're more intimate and they require you to walk right up to them. And the paintings really require you to stand back and look at them from a distance, but you miss something by not also being up close to them. And so I think when I have a show and I have a piece that's really small, that forces someone to walk forward, change their perspective on the painting that's right next to it also, then that works better for me than two competing paintings.
So you have some scribbling in this one, which we can't decipher. Do you want to share what it is, where you got it?
Well, I will say that I know that the writing in this one is mine. But like most of the paintings, I know what I'm doing when I do it, and I can't remember anymore after. And that's part of, I feel like it's like there's a lot of me going into the work that I don't remember maybe exactly what I said or exactly what I've written. And sometimes I'll write something and then I'll write it on the wall right next to it so I don't forget what it was. In this painting, I know that the painting I called Inside Passage, and it related to the estuaries, and a lot of the work I've done has used the water and related to the water in a way of using that as another system that I can work with. And I think, in going back to the objects and the things in the paintings, I think that's where the systems interest me, is this, it kind of comes back to relationships. And with the systems, it's the symbiotic relationship that I was talking about, where there's all these things that are kind of working together to get to a certain goal, and that's the system. I found the water was something that I could relate to for that, and I've used that a lot in the work. It hasn't been as prevalent in my work in the last year or so, but there was a period where I lived on the water, on an island by the beach. So I spent a lot of time early in the morning out on a boat, kind of going through these little estuary areas and photographing, and that fed a lot of the work for a while.
So the way you divide your canvases, it reminds me a little bit of Rothko. Is he in your mind when you do these, or is it just totally something different?
So I wouldn't say that anyone is in my mind. I tend to divide the canvases, and have been for as long as I can remember. And once again, as for different reasons over time. There's a lot of times I use that division of a seen and unseen, or an above and below. So it was, above the water, and then the systems below the water that were happening, or they were above ground, below ground, or visible and invisible. And that's how I've used those spaces over time. And then now the last one we looked at, starting to see how they've kind of morphed into using them as two things happening, connected and not connected, or different times, different places. It's another thing that I've kind of, an element that I've used that's become different things over different times as I've discovered different ways or thought about different ways I wanted to try to use it and what I could do with it. I can look back at a lot of the older work where it started out in a different way completely, where I was dividing pages and in a book. So it kind of went back to the idea of poetry and like a journal, what's on one left side and what's on the right side, and how they're relating in your journal and the writing that became on them. And over time, it just becomes this element of composition that I want to figure out how to use. How am I going to use these two spaces? How are they going to relate to each other? How are they not going to relate? The other part of your question was Rothko. I always have been very interested in his work. I did study a lot of his work. I wrote about his work in college. So it's not absent from me, the way he used a division of space. But what isn't the same type of space is it's not colors interacting with each other, and it's not open fields of space as much as it is how these different objects in the two spaces are interacting or not interacting. In this case, in this painting, the top and the bottom are connected, that once again create a system.
Alan and I take lots of photographs of urban decay. And for me, rather than any natural forms, although of course I can see that as well as you talk about it, for me, this looks like graffiti that's been daubed on a wall in New York or something. It's dripping down the wall. So many of your paintings have these layers of history, which seems like human history. It's like stains of where people have been in the past. And yet you seem to have lived so much in natural environments.
Now, I live in the mountains, and I've lived by the beach. I do see that. I do have a love for that kind of the history of an old wall that exists in this country. And I've spent a lot of time in New York, and I've spent a lot of time in bigger cities where there is a lot more of the older buildings. But I really take a lot from traveling around the world too,
Okay.
and visiting European cities. And the last couple of years, we've been spending a lot of time in Portugal, and
Okay.
and I think that there's a lot of that that's starting to trickle into the work now, after a couple of years of going back and forth and being there and spending time in the city and the history. And there's a lot of the new work that has elements of that I feel are coming from that kind of environment, but more the historical part of it, with ideas of design and geometry and just the history of all that. And I think being around Moorish tiles everywhere, churches and monastery has been another new interest of mine, as far as what's feeding this idea of these two things at the same time, or two different places and interacting, maybe not interacting, but related in somehow, that a connection in somehow. We'll see where that goes, but that's where my work is heading right now, as far as I'm in two places also, and I'm absorbing both things kind of and thinking about them at the same time. And we'll see how it goes.
You do think very, very deeply about what you're doing, not in like a really obvious, conscious, logical way, but you could describe your paintings as philosophical to some extent. Yeah, how does that work with you? And even maybe spirituality as well.
The spirituality part is more the way I use nature and my interest in systems in nature, like the water and the river and the ocean and these areas that are, to me, that there is that spirituality in the work. But there's also there is a lot of life and death and love in the work. That idea is pretty constant as far as love and relationships and a connectedness is kind of a theme in all of the work. To talk about it is difficult in a way because these things build up over so long. Everything is an influence somewhere, it's been influenced, but it's over years of working in a certain way, it's hard to remember where things come from. And it's as I said, they become a language that I'm developing and changing. The language has no rules, right? So I decide what the rules are, and I guess I can change them all the time. And I think that's what allows things, the paintings to change and the paintings to grow, is that I get to change the rules.
How large is this painting?
This painting is about 5 feet by 4 feet, so not a very large painting. It's a common scale for me to use. I don't do many paintings on canvas smaller than that.
How long do you typically spend on a piece like this?
Because of the way I work and the way I'm working in layers and several pieces at the same time, I really think most paintings I'm working on for 2 or 3 months, but I don't think that's not constantly painting on them, but there are points in a painting where I stop and it's just on the wall, and there are points in a painting where I'm painting aggressively or nonstop on it, and then there are points in a painting where there may be a few marks made in a day and I'm off to another painting. And in my process, like, it gets to a point where the painting is beginning to dictate what it needs, and that's just not apparent all at once. I think my most successful paintings are not when I have too much time, but when I have enough time to make both instinctual and decisions that are made based on, well, I know that it's missing something and I don't know what it is, and today I don't know, and then all of a sudden tomorrow I see it somehow and I know, and I add that to the painting, and then takes another couple days to figure out if there's something else. At some point it becomes very obvious to me that I've completed the painting, but sometimes I don't know, and I think that's why they tend to be on the wall for 2 to 3 months. And I may shift a few around here and there, but I can generally work on 4 or 5 at once in here. And so that kind of allows me to kind of pace around the room and make circles, figure out something on one painting, and then that creates a revelation on another painting.
Well, that leads to another question, because on this painting, like, I noticed you have some very light smudging in different parts of it, and you have paint layered over other pieces, so different layers going on. So how do you know when you're finished? How do you know when you finally say, okay, that's it? It feels like it's done.
I just know. I can tell you that sometimes I really know it's not finished, and then one thing just changes all that, and it's, we used the word balance before. There's a balance or an off balance that And I think, this painting shows some restraint because I think you could see that a lot of the lower part is very thin washes, and a lot of the upper part is almost untouched. So left bare gesso. That was an interesting balance that for me to make work. For me on this painting, it did work.
The main motif in it, it looks to me like it's a musical note that's kind of sinking. Did that occur to you at all, or is it just totally me?
No, but I do see that. This one is similar thematically, I guess, to earlier pieces in that the object in the lower part of the painting is much more seed-like to me. There's kind of an above ground, below ground aspect to this piece, which kind of also seems that it has this idea of circular return of the underground, below ground. So this is another one that's very much referencing a life and death. It's using natural forms and biological forms to do that. It's also not my intention that everybody sees the paintings the way I do. So, but there's a general feeling from them that a viewer gets from the painting that I think is the same. I think it's the subject matter seems open to interpretation for most people.
This one's called The Long and Silent Street. Paul mentioned that your titles are often poetic. So how do you come up with your titles?
You picked one right there. This one is from a poem. The title is A Long and Silent Street. It's kind of a very broken piece of a line from an Octavio Paz poem that I was reading. There are a few in the series of these. A good way to start this would be that a lot of the works on paper that I do are like these. They're all rather small. They're 20 by 15 inches. And it's a reoccurring format that I've been doing for about 15 years. And I work on them consistently throughout the year while I'm working on other paintings. And they're a more direct, intimate journal type work for me. They also act in a way that where the paintings are this period of time and layering, and the paintings themselves are representing time in a lot longer frame of time, whereas these feel more about a moment or a much shorter span of time. I like the way that they dissect the painting, that they become almost like small explanations of sections of paintings is when they're hung with the paintings, that they feel like that they're helping, that the two are working together in a way that they're helping decipher each other. I like to use them as this kind of journal, that they're stuff I'm thinking about, stuff I'm working on in the studio. I allow myself the freedom of using real objects sometimes in these that I can transfer, and I use different solvents to transfer different images. I might, well, it's changed over time with technology, but I used to collect things and Xerox them and then use those Xeroxes as plates basically to transfer images and then work from those images into collages. And now I'm able to walk around and take a photograph of the thing I want and then print it out and transfer the image. And so I'm able to use things like that, but I tend to use them exactly the same way as I did a Xerox. The black image in there is still like a black and white Xerox copy of an image that I've transferred into this. I'm using collage. There's old book pages. There's actual seeds encased in a varnish in there. There's a transferred image of a piece, image of a piece of tiled facade of a building in Lisbon in the side there. Some of the geometric kind of lines that I've been getting interested in, these geometric patterns and how they relate to the kind of very organic forms that I'm using. So in this one, to explain where the pieces come from, this series comes from long walks and collecting, which is part of my process, is to collect seeds and things I'm finding that are around that I either like the form of it, or I want to photograph it, or I want to use that piece of a plant in an image like this one. They're definitely reoccurring use of parts of plants in these drawings, and there's a scrapbook element to them. Maybe helpful to see a couple of them to see what I'm talking about with that. But I think this one shows that pretty well, that because it has all the different elements of kind of collage and things that I like to use as far as layering the piece. I even used layers of a clearer paper over other papers, which is a lot like the way I use those light washes of paint over darker areas on the paintings to create that kind of another level over it. And so in the drawings and on the works on paper, there's similar elements that I'm using different materials and different ways of doing, in a more immediate way.
When you started this specific piece, it looks like you kind of had a general idea in mind when you started it. So is that true? Or did you start laying elements down just to see how they would come out?
These particular drawings or collages, they're always the exact same format and size that I rip the paper down to. Like working with the frame of a camera, in a sense, that you get really used to that shape, that format, whether you're working in a square format or a 35mm format. I'm always trying to figure out ways I'm going to use that space. That's my frame. With a lot of these works on paper, the way they start is with one of the objects that I'm using. So in the studio, I might do little paintings and sketches and maybe little pieces that are 3 inches and 4 inches, and they're all over my table, and I add this to them, and they pile up over time, and then they become the objects that I wind up pulling from to start these pieces and work on these pieces. And this one in particular started with the old book page, and I don't know that you can see it from the image here, but on that book page are seeds that were collected from a walk, and those seeds are encased in a varnish that makes the paper translucent and allows you to see the words through the other side. And that image is what I started the piece with. So a lot of times these collage pieces start with smaller pieces on a table, or a torn out section of an old drawing that didn't complete and just took a piece of, or old book pages that I've drawn on or worked on in some way. Those become the kind of basis for the piece. And then from there, adding and collaging and writing, painting. These to me have more of the influence of Asian art and Japanese art than the paintings do, and it's because of the placement, in a sense, and the squares and the use of the negative space. They have only what's needed on them. They have a sparseness and a calmness that's like some music, in a sense, where every note is just where it has to be, and there's not a lot of noise in the background.
Well, to link to another art form, I don't know if this is an influence on you at all, but this and your approach seems to me like ikebana, flat Japanese flower arranging. Literally, you're arranging flowers, but the very sort of exquisite balance you have between the different elements, and nothing is extra, nothing is superfluous. It I didn't feel that before, but your description of how you make them really makes me think of somebody arranging flowers.
I use a lot of these natural plant parts in these drawings a lot of times. And I think seeds and life cycles has been a big influence in my work kind of really since the beginning. Some of the first series of work I can remember were based on seeds. And there's something I still find fascinating about them. I like using them as elements to stand for anything I want them to be. You find them a lot in the works on paper. When you think about my interest in systems in nature and life and death and there all these different types of revolving systems that like seeds becomes a really good symbol for all of it in a sense. Like it's a really good object to describe what I'm thinking about that is like a real object that I can connect to. There's a lot of non-objective in my work in its appearance. But for me to make the work and to be interested in it, it has to relate to these things, these ideas and these things. I need it to be more than color and shape. There needs to be this underlying thing for me. Then when I look at them in the end, I don't know if it's necessary for everybody to see them that way. I think that like I've gotten across what I needed to, whether that's the way somebody else relates to the piece or not.
For me, really fascinating relationship, I guess, between abstraction and representation in your work. I can see that underlying metaphor of seeds and growth connecting it all now. What you've said just makes a lot of sense. The abstraction and representation, now I see how those elements are combining.
I find it difficult to explain coherently. Being able to bounce back and forth between these works on paper and canvas, for me, also allows that kind of discovery, learning things about the pieces that I'm doing that way. And when I can look at them together, then the story feels complete. Like everything kind of comes together for me.
And now I understand why you'd want them to be the smaller works and the larger works displayed together, because there is that real fundamental interaction.
This piece is a good example of that. If this piece is 2 feet tall and it's sitting next to a piece that's 7 or 8 feet tall, and you can kind of go back and forth at the distance and close up with the two pieces, I think they inform each other.
So Steve, I can't thank you enough for the time you spent with us today. You took us on a real journey through your work. I see it in a whole new way now, and I appreciate it on a whole different level. And I really appreciate the generous amount of time that you spent with us today. So thanks so much.
No, I appreciate the interest and involving me. It's a good, it's a nice thing to take part of and to talk to other artists, and it's nice to get a chance to explain a little bit of what I do and what I'm thinking.
Well, thanks again.